views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Welcome to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. On tonight's show, we discuss three distinct and timely issues. Assemblyman David Weprin will be on to tell us about a new bill he sponsors that makes it easier for inmates to be granted parole on their first try. Richard Sklarin, who is also a town councilman, will discuss the legalization of marijuana in New York State and how his town is dealing with the consequences. And finally, a well-known professor, Kathryn S, will be here to discuss child welfare, child maltreatment, and current issues in social care. As you can see, we have much to get to, so stay tuned. Today's verdict starts right now. All right, welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We have with us today Assemblyman David Weprin, friend to the show. David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, David.
All right, well, the first and foremost, we want to talk about the topic and the important bill that you've been sponsoring, the Fair and Timely Parole Bill. Can you just tell the viewers a little bit about it and where are we in terms of getting the bill passed?
Well, we're on the last week of session, although with the pandemic and being able to have sessions remotely, we did come back after the session last year and had a session over the summer. So I don't think it's like the old days where, you know, once the session is over, everything is gone and there's no chance of getting something passed for a year. So I don't think that is the case anymore. So I think we still have, have time. But the fair and timely parole, I'm still hoping it's going to be discussed over the next day or two. But there is a couple of other major pieces of criminal justice legislation that will be taken up. There is a bill called Less is More, and I actually will be debating that on the floor tomorrow. And that Less is More basically changes people being reincarcerated for technical violations. There's been a huge move that people are often on parole and they violate some technical violation, which is not a crime. They show up late for a parole interview or do some other violation of the rules, and they're often reincarcerated. And that's something that there's very strong support to end. So I'm hoping we'll actually get that bill passed this week.
Let's take a step back and talk about just getting the ability to be paroled on the first shot, because I know from what my understanding is, you usually show up before the parole board. It's your first time, and it's almost like a blanket stamp that you're not going to get there, and you're going to have to come back twice, maybe a third time. Why? What's the reason that those who go for the parole board the first time generally never get through?
Well, I think the fair and timely parole will change that. The fair and timely parole basically changes the presumption that you should be looking at first and foremost the individual today and how that individual has changed, which is really the point of the correction system. My committee is called the New York State Assembly Committee on Correction, not the New York State Assembly Committee on Punishment or Incarceration. The point is that there are many incarcerated individuals that commit terrible crimes at the age of 17, 18. They often serve 20, 30, even 40 years. And they're different people. They participate in educational programs while they're incarcerated. They participate in vocational programs, all sorts of programmatic things that the Department of Corrections has. They could be a model inmate. They could be, very responsible in the jobs that they're doing while they're incarcerated, but they're still penalized for the nature of the crime, which is the one factor that they can never change. They can be a changed individual, but they can't change the nature of the original crime. And this particular bill changes that, where that is not the primary look at, that is not the primary thing that the parole board is supposed to look at. They still can deny someone parole and consider the nature of the crime as part of the overall package, but that is not the primary thing that they're looking at, and that changes everything.
Are the victims of some of the crimes giving any kind of pushback that they want to keep, the person incarcerated for a longer period of time, or do they seem to kind of, move a little bit away at this point and just let the system work itself out?
Well, it seems to be in most cases the families of the victims are still very much involved in showing up, on a regular basis, every 2 years usually, to testify against parole. I think it's a hard thing to dispute, because there's a certain emotion. There's family feel they'll never get their loved ones back if they're if they die, if they've been killed, and that particular individual, there often is a feeling that my son, my daughter, will never come back, and this particular person should not get out into society anytime.
And by the way, the inmate, has a family on the outside that the inmate can then go back to, can go back to work, support the family. Also, we're supporting the inmate, and costs, thousands and thousands of dollars while they're incarcerated. There is certainly an advantage financially, to getting this particular individual back into the community. I would just hope that there are other groups who are also supporting the bill as well.
Yeah, there are quite a few. There's a whole coalition of criminal justice advocates, that have been supporting it. There's a group called RAP, Release Aging, people in prison, and there's Normal. There's a Vocal New York. There's a whole bunch of groups that have been advocating for these type of issues. But in this particular case, it doesn't guarantee that the parole board will release someone. It just changes what they should legally look at, and it takes it away from looking at the nature of the crime to looking at the nature of the individual today.
Yeah. By the way, speaking of the financial issue, I would be remiss if I didn't, let the viewers know that, as Assemblyman, you're also running for controller. Tell me a little bit about that. Are you excited? How's it going? The election's not too far away.
Absolutely. It's the Democratic primary, which is really tantamount to the election, because it is a very Democratic city, is less than 2 weeks. It was 2 weeks from yesterday, and it's going very well. We've amassed, over 40 elected officials and about 12 labor unions supporting my candidacy. I have strong support in Queens. I'm the only Queens candidate and supported by the Queens Democratic Organization. I also, despite my criminal justice reform efforts, I'm actually supported by all the police unions as well. And the police unions opposed a lot of the criminal justice stuff that I do, but they recognize that I have the financial background and the experience to manage their pension funds. And the police unions represent 20% of all the pension fund money, and the pension funds are now over $250 billion. And that experience I'm referring to is I served as Deputy Superintendent of Banking for New York State under Governor Mario Cuomo in the 80s. I then went on to a 25-year career in municipal finance on Wall Street with 6 major firms. And when I was in the city council from 2002 through 2009, I chaired the finance committee for 8 years during very tough fiscal times when we had the post 9/11 fiscal crisis and the 2008 Wall Street recession. Wall Street recession. So I really feel I'm uniquely qualified to help bring us out of this pandemic and manage the pension funds. But in particular, even though we got aid from Washington, which was essential for our budget at the state and city level this year, we're anticipating a $45 billion deficit in the next 3-4 years. So I think we're going to have some tough fiscal times, and we need some good management experience.
Well, Assemblyman, you're certainly going to have your work cut out for you, but we wish you good luck. Also, great work with the fair and timely parole bill. Please come back, say hello to the viewers, and good luck with the election.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it.
All right, well, stay with us. Today's verdict has so much more right after this. Welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. This is a topic that I've wanted to discuss for a while. I actually have a friend on right now, Richard Sklarin. Marijuana, all things legalization marijuana. Richard, how are you doing today?
Doing well, David. Great to see you.
All right, listen, I know you as the premier defense attorney at Miranda, Slone, Sklarin, LLP, whatever. But we're here to talk to you in terms of your capacity as a town councilman. And specifically, when it comes to the legalization of marijuana and how certain towns are dealing with this now, because there are a lot of nuances with the law, maybe we could just take a step back and you could just let the viewers know a little bit about the legalization and you could kind of maybe take it from there.
Sure, that would be great, David. Good to be with you. This is called the MRTA, Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. It was just signed by Governor Cuomo as of March 31, 2021. A couple of things it does immediately. So up to 3 ounces of marijuana, someone 21 or over, it's legal to possess that. So you can smoke marijuana out in public. If you had a joint, you could do that immediately. It also serves to expunge any prior criminal convictions referable to marijuana possession and the like, as long as it's not tied in with something else, a violent crime, et cetera. So those are 2 things that happen immediately. And there's a social justice component to that, to be sure. People who have been convicted of crimes based upon just use of marijuana, that rectifies that social inequity that's been there. So what this does is that this sets up a 5-member cannabis control board. So that's going to be appointed by the governor and assembly and senate, total 5 people. They'll oversee what's going to be called an office of cannabis management. And that office is going to work out all the regulatory issues associated with this new legislation, which is going to take some time. And then they're also going to oversee issuing licenses for marijuana sales and cultivation, et cetera.
With respect to the new law, there's going to be the have and the have-nots. There are going to be those who are going to be benefiting with a storefront, those who will be benefiting with maybe a lounge, those who may want to distribute it, sell it, and from the area within the town. So how do the towns throughout New York State deal with these particular issues?
Well, overall, the state is predicting this will generate $350 million annually in revenue. And that'll create between 30 and 60,000 jobs. We'll see if that comes out to play, because government's not exactly accurate in predicting how revenue will generate or what jobs will be created. But at the town level, it's a potential opportunity economically, because there's a 13% total tax burden on the sales, and 4% of the tax can go to the locality. So for example, let's say you have a retail dispensary that's established, they get a license, they come to a particular town. The locality can get, as I understand it, as it currently stands, 4% of that revenue. So if you have $1 million generated from a local retail dispensary in a town in northern Westchester, such as mine, the town potentially can get $40,000 in revenue. And from a cost benefit analysis, our town is going to have to evaluate, like other towns across New York State, whether that's worthwhile, and also whether the people who we represent actually want it in their community.
And you have the right to opt out of that. I mean,
that's correct. When it comes to opting out, this pertains to retail establishments as well as on-site consumption, those two categories. And by July 19th, so this is very topical, by July 19th, the town has to make a decision whether they're going to opt out of those portions of the law. And that timetable is a hard time, because from that point, if the voters want to essentially override what the town's going to do, in a pure exercise of democracy, 10% of the eligible voters can submit a petition within 45 days thereafter, so it can be on the ballot in November.
Does it look like that's something that may happen in your town? Are you getting the sense that 10% want this so badly they don't even want to give you a chance to opt out, or no?
Well, we're going to discuss this actually starting next week. We're going to have a discussion and hear from the public about this. We've had one meeting earlier in the year, just a preliminary meeting. But my sense from my constituents across our town is that they are not in favor of it. And it seems to actually break down. We have an older town. So it seems to actually break down a lot of it by age. That's my anecdotal sense, where people, less young people like ourselves may not necessarily favor, and younger people are more in favor of it. People are I think concerned about any adverse impact in the community, whether or not it's actually turns out to be so or not.
But here's the thing, Richard. There are liquor stores they're all throughout towns, and they've been there for years. Maybe Sundays they might have been closed for certain reasons, but certainly every day of the week you could get yourself a Jack Daniels or whatever you want, and towns let that show up. So do you really think there's going to be a lot of pushback, or what are your thoughts? I mean, do you think you're going to allow it, or you're not really sure at this point?
I guess your point is a valid one, as far as if you're making a moral argument against it. The consistency, when in near my house, we do have a liquor store in a shopping center, as well as a cigar store right next door, which is selling vaping products. So then are you going to be okay with those, and then against putting in a retail dispensary? So people are not necessarily consistent in their views on this.
And think of the lounge, which you may opt out of. I mean, people go to bars and restaurants all the time drinking alcohol together. Some don't even eat, they just drink. So is it really any different when you have a lounge and everyone's kind of smoking in the lounge, or cigar bars, that type of thing? So yeah, it almost falls on a moral ground in some respects.
Right. And
I'm curious where it's going to head.
Right. And there's certainly a lot of information out there that the adverse health impact from marijuana is a lot less than it would be from cigarettes or alcohol. So it can be a tough argument to make.
Well, listen, certainly your job as a town councilman, completely different than your job as a defense attorney at Miranda's office, where I see you. So you certainly educated me. And I'm hoping maybe you come back and let us know what happens with the vote.
I would be delighted to. That'd be great.
That's great. All right. Stay with us. Today's verdict has so much more coming back right after this. Okay, welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, David Lesch. We have with us today Kathryn Krase, who's an expert really in everything having to do with child abuse, child neglect. And I know you, the viewers, have been asking me to get this subject on air. So Kathryn, thanks for being here today.
It's my pleasure to be here, David. Thanks for having me.
So one of the reasons I think the viewers have been asking for this type of topic is that they themselves have been impacted. Either sometimes their children have been taken away, or they have seen neglect or abuse in the community. So maybe you could just educate them fairly briefly on the difference between child abuse, child neglect, and child endangerment, if you could.
Sure. So child maltreatment is the larger term that's used across the United States. And here in New York State, we specifically talk about child abuse, child neglect. We also have child sexual abuse, medical neglect. There are lots of terms, so sometimes it can be really confusing. But I think the The broader term, child maltreatment, talks about the fact that parents have a responsibility, parents or other caretakers of children have a legal responsibility for their care. And there are certain situations when those parents or caretakers aren't doing what they're supposed to. And so in the case of child abuse or child sexual abuse, those are usually overt acts. Those are things where parents or caretakers are doing something to the child that should not be done. So oftentimes we talk about child physical abuse. We're talking about using corporal punishment on a child to the point at which the child gets an injury. They get a bruise, they get a broken bone, they get scratched, they have a burn. And those are usually less complicated cases for people to identify because you're seeing what's happening. You're seeing the physical impact of the parent's behavior. Child sexual abuse impacts estimates of up to out of every 4 children will be sexually abused in their childhood. And we don't have those same physical indicators to identify when children are being sexually abused. And not everybody who victimizes children sexually are parents or caretakers. They can be members of an extended family or neighbors, et cetera. So that's another area. And then we have this more amorphous or less clear concept of child neglect. And with child neglect, we're not really talking about something that's been necessarily done to a child, but more often with child neglect, we're talking about things that a parent or caretaker should have done for a child that wasn't done or isn't being done, and therefore is putting the child at risk.
Well, so who oversees this whole area? In other words, they see something, say something, right? So who oversees the neglect, the abuse, the endangerment? What body of government will look at this?
So ultimately, the government body that's been tasked with responding is what we call the Child Protective Services or the Child Welfare System. And that's generally a local level government. Here in New York City, we have the Administration for Children's Services or Children's Services. It used to be called BCW, the Bureau of Child Welfare, or DSS, depending on how long you've been in the city. But that system is ultimately supervised by the state through the Office of Child and Family Services here in New York. And then across the country, each state has their own child protective services with local county level or city level, in our case, oversight.
So let's walk through it. So let's say, I think there's somebody, a neighbor there's a child, there could be some sexual abuse going on. Who do I call?
So if you as a concerned citizen want to make a report of suspected child abuse, you can call in New York City 311, and 311 would connect you to what we call the statewide central registry of child abuse and maltreatment. It's actually up outside of Albany, but it's a hotline number here in New York State where you would provide your concerns and they would be able to tell you if what your concerns are equate with abuse or neglect. And if they believe that your concerns do involve abuse or neglect, they'll start a case and they'll send out an investigator from the local Child Protective Services unit to do an investigation.
Now, what rights do you have as the parent to make sure that maybe you want an attorney there, maybe you want to not have to answer any questions, maybe you don't want them to even look at your child? What are your rights as a parent?
So because of the legal tenet of parens patriae, meaning that the state has a right to protect children, not just parents have a right to protect children, parents do have some right to limit state intervention with their children, but ultimately the state or the city ACS could get access to a subpoena or get access to your child against your wishes. Like they can go to this, there's case law that says that they can go to the school and talk to school officials, et cetera. They can get medical records without getting parent permission, et cetera. So it's a hazy area. But as a parent advocate, I always recognize and I encourage parents who've been the subject of a report to seek out legal advice. And here in New York City, we are super lucky because we have a growth in what we call our institutional providers, which are agencies that are helping to represent parents in family court. And so you can actually start calling some of these agencies. Each county generally has one of these agencies that you can get at least initial advice about how to protect yourself during an investigation.
Well, listen, I know you wear a lot of different hats, professor, attorney, advocate. What have you seen in your experience recently with respect to COVID and whether or not there's been any kind of uptick in neglect, abuse, endangerment?
So the plurality or the source of reports that comes from the largest source actually come from schools. So when schools closed down across New York City and across the country last March, so did reports to CPS. And CPS got very, very nervous around the country. The major concerns, and we heard them in the news, was that maybe there was child abuse and neglect happening in the home and children were no longer going to be able to be protected because we weren't seeing it happen, right? The teachers and the school personnel who generally were seeing children on a regular basis weren't making those reports. So we saw reports plummeting. We won't know for a few years, actually, if the incidence of child abuse and neglect went up. But what we do know is that in general, most reports, pretty much 3/4 of reports, do not get substantiated after investigation, meaning that even the most well-meaning reporters are often calling in cases where there actually isn't abuse or neglect, or there's just not enough
Does that,
evidence.
by the
of
way,
abuse or
end up
neglect.
on somebody's report or something where, does the state always know that, let's say if it was, God forbid, me and somebody put a claim against me, will it always show up somewhere, internet, job application? I mean, does this stuff stick with you? These false reports is what I'm trying to say.
So in cases,
Unsubstantiated
reports, right? So if you have a report that's unsubstantiated or they don't make a decision after investigation that says they believe there's evidence that of the alleged maltreatment, the report will stay in the system in case another report comes up later. The system wants to know that there's been a report on this family or this child before. However, employers or searches won't be able to find those unsubstantiated reports. If, however, the report is substantiated, even if your child doesn't get removed from the home, those reports will stay in the system and can be found through what we call a CARI check, a Child Abuse Registry Index check. Here in New York State, those substantiated reports on your CARI check will stay there for 10 years after the youngest child in the household at the time of the report turns 18. So if you have a 1-year-old in your household when you have a substantiated case, that will be on your report
it's
for 27 years.
Obviously very important to make sure that you have counsel to protect your rights. If this is unfortunately something that's an allegation against you.
And there are ways, if you have let's say you go to college or you have a degree in which the job is going to necessitate you to get a CARI check, whether it's education or healthcare, there are also pathways to challenging that CARI registry, meaning that you can ask the state to hide that report so that it doesn't impact your employment.
Thank you, Professor. It was a lot for us to digest. I think we gave the viewers a lot today, which is important. And I'm hoping you come back, maybe educate us a little further.
I'd be happy to. Thanks for having me, David.
It's a pleasure. All right. We have so much more. Stay with us. Today's verdict keeps going right now. All right, well, that's all we have for tonight's show. I'd like to thank you, the viewers, for watching. And of course, if you have an issue or topic you'd like to see on a future Today's Verdict with David Lesch, just email me at davidlesch@bronxnet.org. Until the next time, know the issues, reach a verdict. See you in 2 weeks.